There are moments when we rush past the things that carry us, never pausing to think about the minds that shaped them. We board trains, cross cities, trace the arcs of highways and skylines. And so often it all blurs into routines: steel, glass, speed, putt. But behind those lines and silhouettes are human hands, a single imagination pushing against the limits of its age. In a world that measures value in horsepower and tonnage, there are a few rare figures who understood that movement itself could be sculpted, that machines could be more than tools. See, they could be poetry in metal. Tonight, instead of listing specifications and records, we slow down. We listen for the faint echo of a pencil on paper, the hush of a designer leaning over a drawing board late at night, trying to capture what the future should feel like. TIS is not just about what moved on the rails or rolled along the roads. This is about the person who gave motion a face, whose work turned functional shapes into icons, whose vision made people look twice and think, "That's tomorrow." Imagine a time when trains were mostly brute force: boilers, rivets, exposed machinery, all purpose, and almost no grace. Cohen, in that era, someone dared to ask a different question. What if power could be beautiful? What if the roar of a locomotive could be wrapped in a form that looked like it had cut through time itself? Into that question stepped an industrial designer with a talent not just for solving problems, but for making people feel something the moment they laid eyes on a machine. Cool, Raymond Loewy did not simply decorate what engineers built. He reshaped the way motion was presented to the world. Where others saw a tangle of pipes and metal, he saw flowing lines, smooth curves, and a sense of speed even when the wheels were still. He was already known for sculpting everyday objects into unforgettable silhouettes. A simple bottle, something held in millions of hands, became more than packaging under his guidance. In his hands, it became a symbol recognized instantly, a shape people could identify even in the dark. Same approach extended to the road, where a bus no longer had to be just a box on wheels. Coach. He transformed a coach into a moving landmark, giving it sweeping lines and a profile that suggested travel was not just a necessity, but a small adventure, from the shelf to the street. He understood that people respond to forms that feel alive, as if the object itself has a story to tell before a word is spoken. So when a railway, dreaming of something bold and almost impossible, set out to build a locomotive that would dominate the rails in both power and presence, they turned to him. The machine they were crafting was enormous, experimental, and far beyond ordinary practice. It would be long, heavy, and incredibly fast, a giant of steam meant to race across the landscape, challenging tracks and timetables alike. Many might have been content to let such a behemoth look as intimidating as it sounded. A mass of exposed steel and industrial aggression. But Raymond Loewy saw an opportunity. He wrapped this colossus in a skin that borrowed from the language of Art Deco. Sweeping forms, enclosed machinery, metal that seemed to flow like water over the frame. Instead of a tangle of pipes, the locomotive wore a continuous body, skirting that ran low and sleek. A nose that sloped forward, as if the train were leaning into the future. It no longer looked like a collection of parts. It looked like a single idea, restless and determined. Underneath the casing, the fire still raged, the pistons still hammered, the wheels still thundered, but from the outside it appeared almost serene. People who saw it in person didn't just notice the size. They remembered the shape, the way it seemed to compress speed into a streamlined form. In a time when the world was uncertain and change could be frightening, this design said something quietly revolutionary. The future could be powerful and elegant at the same time. Raymond Loewy worked at the intersection of engineering and emotion. He respected what the builders and mechanics created. Without them, nothing would move. But he also understood that humans connect first with what they see. A locomotive, a bottle, a bus before anyone knows the specifications. They feel the outline, the balance, the rhythm of curves and angles. He gave those forms a human touch, a sense of coherence, as if everything from the smallest ridge to the grandest sweep of metal had been placed there with intention. To watch his work glide past was to realize that function and beauty did not have to be rivals. In the locomotive he helped shape, the message was clear. This was not just a vehicle to drag cars down a line. This was a symbol placed at the edge of an era, bridging the old world of raw industrial power and the emerging age of design-conscious technology. It did not merely arrive, it made an entrance. People gathered to see it, the way they might gather to see a new monument or a piece of sculpture. Photographers sought the best angle. Children stared, sensing that they were looking at something different from the usual rumble and smoke. This was steam reimagined, wrapped in a body that seemed to whisper that steel could dream. His influence didn't remain locked to the rails. Look at that familiar bottle and you see how he condensed identity into a single continuous gesture of glass. Look at that long-distance bus and you see how he turned long travel from a simple necessity into an experience that at least looked glamorous, even if the seats were still worn and the roads still rough. He understood that people move through the world guided by impressions. The curve of a window, the tilt of a front end, the way light reflects off polished metal. Every form tells its own quiet story, and he wanted those stories to be optimistic yet. Like all human work, his creations were bound by time. The locomotive he dressed so boldly would one day be deemed impractical. Too large, too complex, for the evolving network around it. The world shifted toward standardized fleets and more efficient arrangements. And the magnificent experiment was eventually retired, sent down the long track toward memory. But the impression it left refused to fade. Model makers recreated it in miniature. Artists referenced its lines. Historians spoke of it, not only as a technical curiosity, but as a moment when design and engineering stood shoulder to shoulder, daring to imagine what a train could look like if someone gave it the silhouette of a dream. Raymond Loewy himself moved on to other challenges, other objects, other canvases of industry. But the themes remained: clarity, simplicity, motion implied even in stillness. The arcs and sweeps he drew found their way into daily life, quietly shaping how people expected modernity to appear. Whether someone ever knew his name or not, they knew his influence. They felt it when their eye was drawn along a curve that just felt right. Or when a piece of machinery seemed less intimidating because its form was gracious rather than harsh. It is easy, now, to take such things for granted. We live in a time when almost every object is designed and redesigned, when sleek silhouettes and aerodynamic forms are everywhere. But there was a moment when this was not the norm. When it took a particular courage to say, yes. This locomotive must be powerful, but it must also be beautiful. In that moment, Raymond Loewy stood in the middle of drafting tables and workshops, bridging the gap between the engineer's calculations and the passenger's first glimpse from a platform. He showed that aesthetics are not an afterthought. They are part of how we experience progress, part of what makes technology feel human. To remember him is to remember that someone once looked at a roaring machine and imagined it clothed in grace. Is to picture long lines of travelers watching a streamlined train slide into the station, the polished surfaces reflecting sky and smoke. And to realize that this vision did not appear by accident. It emerged from countless choices. This curve, not that one. This angle, not the easier line. This bold sweep of metal instead of exposed chaos. Gave horizon and hope a physical outline. Now, as the years move on and the world speeds further into the future he once hinted at, his work sits quietly in photographs, in preserved machines, in the shapes we no longer question. One day, every locomotive he touched will be only memory. The bottles will be artifacts in glass cases. The buses will appear in old films and faded adverts, their journeys long since over. But the lesson he left does not rust or crack. It endures. That even in the harshest roar of industry, there is room for harmony, for line and light, for the kind of beauty that makes people pause when you see an object that looks effortlessly right. Remember, there was once someone who struggled to make it so. For so many of the forms that defined the 20th century's idea of the future, that someone was Raymond Loewy. There is a hall where the air feels different the moment you step inside, where light filters across steel and wood and glass in a way that makes the past feel within reach. In that space, engines that once thundered across continents now stand silent, and machines that once defined the sound of progress rest under soft illumination. It is more than a building. It is a vessel for memory. On the walls, and in the very name above the entrance, is a reminder that behind every age of industry there was a person, a mind, a will that refused to accept the limits it was given. The Henry Ford Museum bears that name like a quiet echo, a sign that one life's vision can be broad enough to frame countless other stories. Within its walls, a colossal locomotive, one of the great giants of steam, is displayed as both artifact and tribute, not only to the engineers who built it, but to the larger spirit of innovation that the museum's namesake embodied. Henry Ford's presence in that place is felt in more than letters carved in stone. His name becomes a kind of guiding voice, not heard but sensed, urging us to look at these machines not as cold relics, but as milestones in a long human journey. He was part of a generation that believed machines were not just tools for the powerful, but bridges to a different kind of life for ordinary people. A generation convinced that technology could redraw the lines of distance, time, and opportunity. Carries his name stands as a physical answer to a simple but profound question. What happens when one person is determined to gather the story of how things are made, how they move, and how they shaped the lives of millions. Walk through that museum, and you move through a landscape of ambitions. Tao. In one corner, you find towering locomotives, built to drag impossible loads over mountains and plains. In another, delicate, early inventions, fragile, but daring. All of them share one thing. They are expressions of human problem-solving, of someone, somewhere, looking at a world full of obstacles and choosing to respond with creativity rather than surrender. When you think of Henry Ford in that context, you see him not just as a figure from history, but as a lens through which these stories are brought into focus. Cat. The museum is less a monument to one man and more a continuum of effort and imagination in which his name is thread, stitching many narratives together. In the shadow of that rescued mountain locomotive, its vast frame, now at rest on indoor tracks, you can almost sense the dual legacy at work. On the one hand, there is the machine itself, once roaring through fog and coal smoke, now silent but imposing, a reminder of the era when steam was king. On the other, there is the choice to preserve it, to rescue it from rust and oblivion, to place it where future generations might stand in awe. That choice is part of Henry Ford's story. He understood that progress without memory is incomplete, that a future built without remembering the path taken can easily forget who it serves. In giving his name to a place dedicated to keeping such artifacts alive in people's imaginations, he ensured that the noise of industry would not dissolve entirely into silence, but instead be translated into understanding. What does it mean to honor someone whose influence is woven so deeply into the fabric of modern life that it's almost invisible? It might mean noticing the everyday miracle of movement, the way goods cross nations, the way people travel to work, the way families gather from far-flung places, and recognizing that behind these patterns lies the work of countless innovators, including those who dared to rethink how machines should be made, used, and shared. Henry Ford's name is often spoken as shorthand for a certain vision of industry. But in the museum that carries his name, that vision is quietly expanded. His legacy is not praised with grand speeches, but with carefully restored artifacts, patient curation, simple, and the simple act of letting visitors stand face to face with the machines that shaped the modern world. In that setting, a child may lay a hand on the cool railing and stare up at a locomotive that seems too large to be real, listening to a guide describe how it once stormed through distant valleys. A parent might read a plaque and think about the sheer effort required to bring such a creation into existence. An elder might remember the last time they heard a whistle echo across a field. All of these small moments are possible because someone believed it was worth the cost and effort to gather these machines under one roof. Henry Ford, whose name now serves as a banner over that intent, becomes a quiet collaborator with every visitor, inviting them to see technology not merely as background noise, but as a story in which they too have a part. There is an irony in how time works on people and on machines. The locomotive, preserved there, once a roaring force on the rails, now stands silent but intact. Henry Ford, the man, is gone, yet his influence lingers in design, in manufacturing, in the idea that large-scale production can reshape society, for better or worse. The museum bridges that gap, its very existence whispers that neither steel nor flesh is truly permanent, but the choices they make possible can ripple outward long after both are gone. In the presence of that vast engine, protected from the rain and sun, you feel the weight of decisions, to build, to risk, to refine, to share. It is tempting to reduce a figure like Henry Ford to a single idea, a single sentence in a history book. Yet, the halls that carry his name resist that reduction. They show how complex the story of progress really is. Triumph and challenge, ingenuity and consequence, hope and limitation. The machines on display are not perfect. Some were flawed experiments, others short-lived marvels. Many built in times when the world did not yet understand the full cost of its own advancement. In allowing these artifacts to stand as they are, without polishing away every rough edge, the museum presents a more honest portrait of the age Henry Ford helped define. It is a portrait in which he is neither saint nor villain, but a human being wrestling with the possibilities of his time. When we remember him through this lens, we move beyond numbers and dates. We see a person who believed that access to machines could transform daily life, that making things more attainable could open doors for people who had long stood outside. We also see someone whose ideas would be copied, challenged, and reinterpreted by those who followed. In this way, Henry Ford becomes part of a longer chain, linked to every engineer, designer, and worker whose creations share the museum floor. The big steam locomotive that greets visitors does not stand there alone. It is framed by the broader narrative of industrial change that his life helped set in motion. Standing in that hall, too, you might notice the silence of the preserved locomotive and imagine what it would be like if its firebox were lit once more, if its massive rods began to move, if its whistle split the air. But then you realize that in a different way, it is already alive. It breathes through the footsteps of visitors, the pointing fingers, the quiet explanations from parent to child. It is alive because Henry Ford and those who worked with him believed that remembering such machines mattered. Without that belief, the locomotive might have been cut apart, sold for scrap, and lost to time. Instead, it is a teacher, a witness, a bridge to an era when steam and steel were the language of ambition. To honor Henry Ford, then, is not merely to repeat his name or list his achievements. It is to recognize the space he helped create for memory, a space where the story of human ingenuity is kept tangible, where kids can stand dwarfed by a mountain of metal and feel both small and inspired. It is to acknowledge that he saw value in gathering these objects, not as trophies, but as lessons pent. The museum that bears his name reminds us that progress should not erase its own footsteps. It should remember them, examine them, and offer them to those who come next. As the years continue to roll forward, the machines may seem more distant, their mechanisms old-fashioned compared to digital systems and silent motors, yet the questions they posed remain urgent. How do we build? For whom do we build? What do we choose to keep? And what are we willing to forget? Henry Ford's name, etched into the identity of that museum, invites each visitor to wrestle with those questions in their own way. In that ongoing conversation, his presence endures not as a statue or a slogan, but as a quiet, persistent reminder that the story of industry is etot at its heart, a story about people, their dreams, and the machines they leave behind. There are museum halls where the past feels close, but there are also landscapes far beyond those walls, where the mark of a name endures in subtler ways, long after the machinery has gone quiet and the early factories have changed or disappeared. A certain current remains underflow of ideas that shaped how people work, travel, and imagine possibility. For some figures, that influence spreads outward, not in a single dramatic wave, but through countless smaller ripples that continue drifting across generations. And in the traces of these ripples, you can sense the weight of a legacy that refuses to settle into stillness. Henry Ford's name is woven into that ongoing motion, not as a relic, but as a kind of echo carried forward every time someone wonders how an idea might become real enough to touch music. When you consider the world that existed before the changes associated with his era took hold, you picture a slower rhythm, distances that felt larger, choices that seemed narrower, opportunities that stayed closed to many. But then you imagine the shift, the gradual acceleration brought by the belief that everyday people should have access to tools that bridge those distances. The idea that efficiency could be harnessed not simply for profit but for the expansion of possibility began to reshape how industries thought about themselves. Henry Ford's influence sits at the heart of that turning point. Not just the notion of building at scale, but the insistence that ordinary workers should stand at the center of technological transformation, not at the margins. His name became a shorthand for the belief that machines could be instruments of change on a deeply human level. Walk through the stories connected to his time, and you see how that belief radiated outward. The machines in the museum, locomotives, towering like monuments. Early inventions, delicate as sketches, become part of a broader tapestry. They reveal a world that once brimmed with questions. Could travel be faster? Could work be safer? Could daily life be reshaped so families had more time and more choices? Henry Ford's role in that landscape is not merely mechanical, it is philosophical. Is the idea that the world could be reorganized to bring far-off horizons within reach of people who had long been told to accept limitations. He stood among others who believed progress should not be reserved for the privileged few. And that shared aspiration is reflected in the countless artifacts preserved under the banner of his name. Music, but legacy is never simple. As decades passed, the ideas he championed evolved, stretched, and sometimes strained under the weight of new expectations. Industries grew larger, machines became more intricate, and society found itself asking new questions about the cost of advancement. Through all of this, his influence persisted not as an unchanging symbol, but as a point of reference in the ongoing conversation about how technology intersects with daily life. The museum that carries his name embodies that complexity. It preserves not only triumphs, but challenges. Not only marvels, but the traces of difficult decisions. In doing so, it invites visitors to step into the nuance rather than retreat from it. That willingness to hold the full story is part of what keeps his legacy alive. Walk deeper into the galleries. The atmosphere shifts as you approach the displays dedicated to transportation. vehicles that once defined whole eras of mobility. The preserved locomotive, towering in its stillness, feels like a companion to the countless innovations that flowed from the world Henry Ford helped shape. Its presence underscores something that's easy to forget. Progress is not linear. It is a series of leaps, stumbles, revisions, and There were machines that revolutionized travel, and machines that faded quickly. There were ideas that transformed society, and ideas that remained hopeful experiments. By gathering them side by side, the museum becomes a reflection of the world he inhabited, a world full of striving, error, and astonishing breakthroughs. Music outside those walls, curated displays. The echoes of his influence can still be sensed in the daily rhythms of life, in the hum of a morning commute, in the patterns of modern work, in the ways people plan and dream. The world today is vastly different from the one he knew. Yet certain underlying principles remain recognizable. The belief that production can shape opportunity, that design can shape experience, that technology can shape society. These ideas stretch far beyond any single invention. They exist in conversations about how cities should grow, how people should travel, how communities should connect. Even though the world has evolved in ways he could never have predicted, the questions he raised about access, about efficiency, about the power of machines to change daily life still resonate. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy is not a device or a process, but a mindset. The mindset that asks, how do you take something distant and make it reachable? How do you transform a dream into something manufactured, repeatable, and real? This mindset can be seen in young engineers sketching prototypes, in designers searching for clarity in the curve of a product, in students looking at machines not with intimidation but curiosity. Henry Ford's name becomes a symbolic companion to that curiosity. A reminder that innovation thrives when people refuse to accept that things must remain as they are. Music, and yet, within that spirit of ambition, there is also a quiet humility in the way his legacy is preserved. The museum does not elevate him above the machines, nor the machines above the people who built and used them. Instead, it presents a continual man understanding that every breakthrough rests on the shoulders of countless workers, creators, and dreamers. This sense of interconnectedness gives his memory a grounded, human quality. Reminds visitors that even the most influential figures are part of a larger story. That is why the preserved locomotive stands not as a monument to him alone, but as a symbol of the world that his ideas helped make possible. Through each generation that walks those halls, his influence shifts slightly, taking on new relevance. For some, he represents the drive to innovate. For others, the importance of preserving industrial history. For others still, the reminder that great ideas can influence millions. And for many, he is all of these at once. In this way, Henry Ford becomes less a singular historical figure and more a constant presence in the unfolding narrative of how societies build, adapt, and dream forward. Music. To honor him is to look at the machines around us, old and new, and recognize the link between imagination and transformation. Is to stand in the museum that bears his name, and feel the connection between the hands that shaped metal a century ago and the hands that touch screens and tools today. It is to understand that while time moves on, the desire to push beyond the familiar remains unchanged. And it is to acknowledge that his legacy continues, not because it is perfect, but because it is part of the ongoing effort to understand what progress means and how best to pursue it. There are legacies that move like locomotives, loud, forceful, impossible to ignore, and then there are legacies that move like a long, steady current beneath the surface, reshaping shorelines over years rather than moments. Henry Ford's legacy lives in both realms. See, it has the unmistakable roar of transformation, the kind that shifts an entire century's rhythm. But it also has the quiet endurance of ideas that continue influencing how people think about work, mobility, and possibility long after the factories of his era have changed their sounds and their tools. In tracing his story across time, you begin to understand that it is less about the machines themselves and more about what those machines set in motion: patterns of life, patterns of thought, patterns of ambition that spread far beyond the trajectories he originally imagined. Consider how deeply his presence is felt in the spaces between places in the roads that stretch like arteries across continents, in the neighborhoods built around new forms of mobility, in the schedules and routines shaped by vehicles that once seemed extraordinary and now pass without a second thought. Even as technology evolves, even as engines become cleaner and propulsion shifts toward electrical silence, the foundation of accessible transportation remains firmly tied to the concept that guided his work: that movement should belong to everyone, not just the privileged few. In that sense, his name echoes not in the loud declarations of history books, but in the daily hum of life as people commute, visit family, explore, and chase dreams farther than previous generations ever could. If you walk through the museum named after him, you see that this influence is not preserved as a monument of unchanging reverence. Instead, it unfolds as a conversation, a series of exhibits, quietly reminding visitors that innovation is both daring and imperfect, transformative and demanding. Machines that once seemed flawless now show their quirks and limitations. Early designs reveal the trial-and-error nature of progress. In this setting, Henry Ford is not presented as a distant titan, but as a human being whose ideas sparked both success and complexity. The museum honors the fullness of that story, allowing visitors to engage with a genuine portrait rather than a simplified ideal. And perhaps that is the most meaningful way to remember him, through the interplay of machinery and meaning, invention and interpretation. When someone stands before the towering locomotive preserved under the museum's lights, they see more than metal and bolts. They see the scale of ambition that defined his era. They witness a world wrestling with the challenge of making technology not just powerful, but dynamic enough to change how societies function. That locomotive, though not his creation, belongs to the larger tapestry of innovation he championed. It is a sibling to the ideas he brought forward: mass, movement, access, and together they create a dialogue across generations about what progress feels like when it arrives. Step closer to that locomotive, and you feel time compress. The shadows cast by its wheels suggest decades of rails stretching into mountains and valleys. C. The enormity of its boiler and frame gives weight to the labor of countless hands. And then the memory of Henry Ford's influence surfaces not in the engine's mechanics, but in the understanding that preserving such a machine is itself an act of respect for change. That it is a reminder that someone believed these giants were worth saving, worth sharing, worth studying. Tessa name above the museum's entrance becomes a testament to that belief. That the story of how things move is forever tied to the story of how people live beyond the museum. Beyond the artifacts, his legacy has become something quieter, something woven into expectations. Toe. We expect mobility. Cut. We expect access. We expect that distance can be bridged with relative ease. These expectations did not exist in the same way before the waves of industrial change his generation helped set in motion. Today, even as new technologies redefine transportation, from autonomous vehicles to high-speed networks, the underlying principles echo the early ideals he helped articulate: efficiency, accessibility, and a belief that machines can improve the quality of everyday life if designed with purpose. Yet, his story also reminds us that innovation is neither simple nor for every advancement, there are consequences to confront. For every leap forward, there are adjustments that must be made. The museum bearing his name does not shy away from this truth. It allows visitors to see the evolution of industry with clear eyes, to admire the achievements while acknowledging the costs, to appreciate the breakthroughs while recognizing the imperfections. This honesty gives his legacy depth and longevity, in ensuring it continues to spark thought rather than settle into uncritical nostalgia. Imagine standing near one of the displays dedicated to early machinery, watching families pause and whisper as they try to understand how different life once was. In those moments, Henry Ford's influence is not a distant abstraction. It becomes something tangible, a doorway through which people glimpse the roots of their present. The machines that surround them, some elegant, some rugged, some monumental, form a mosaic of perseverance and creativity. Becomes one voice among many in that mosaic, but an essential one, shaping the idea that technology can be democratized and shared widely. The longer you remain in that space, the more you realize that his story is not confined to the early 1900s. It threads forward into conversations happening now about manufacturing, automation, sustainability, and the future of mobility. His legacy becomes less about looking back and more about grappling with what comes next. How do we apply the lessons of the past to build responsibly? 2. How do we innovate without forgetting the human lives at the center of every transformation? These questions hover in the air, subtle but persistent, and they carry the weight of his influence as you exit the museum or reflect on his life from afar. You may find yourself imagining what he would think of the modern world of silent electric rides, of factories where robots and people work side by side, of vehicles that navigate by sensors rather than maps, of global networks that link communities across continents. It is impossible to know, of course, but the curiosity itself speaks to the reach of his legacy. People still ask the question, because they recognize the foundational role he played. His ideas were not endpoints. They were beginnings. The world built atop them has branched into realities even he might have considered extraordinary, and in that sense, honoring Henry Ford becomes an act of reflection. It is not about idolizing a single figure. It is about acknowledging the enduring impact of a mind that believed machines could change the world, then set in motion a chain of innovations that proved the belief true. It is about remembering that progress is built by people who dare to imagine differently, even when they cannot predict the full consequences of their visions. It is about recognizing that every machine, every invention, every shift in industry carries within it the fingerprints of countless hands, including his.